So now it's our great joy to have Thom Hartmann return to Bioneers. Thom is another astonishing polymath whose range of knowledge is matched by his insight for the main thing. He has an exceptional generosity of spirit and a deeply compassionate grasp of human psychology and our spiritual capacities as well. And he'll be speaking later on the panel about democracy versus plutocracy. Thom is the #1 progressive syndicated talk show host nationally and internationally. His shows are available in over 500 million homes worldwide, including through our friends at Free Speech TV, where Bioneers shows also air. He's the best-selling author of 24 books that are in print in 17 languages on 5 continents. He's won the Best Censored Stories Award for investigative journalism 4 times. Leonardo DiCaprio was inspired by Thom's book, The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, to make the movie The 11th Hour, in which Thom appears along with many Bioneers. And he also was in inspired Leo's movie Ice on Fire. As a former psychotherapist, Thom wrote the book Attention Deficit Disorder, A Different Perspective, which sparked a national debate on ADD, ADHD, and numerous neurological differences ranging from giftedness to autism. Thom and his longtime business partner and wife, Louise, have lived on several continents, and they somehow seem to have a knack for landing in the world's hottest hotspots just when massive upheavals have erupted. Please join me in welcoming Thom Hartmann from the current hotspot of massive upheaval right here in the US of A.
So pleased to be here. I wanted to talk today about a lie that we have been told and a very empowering and hopeful truth that almost all of us don't know. And the lie is that the normal architecture of life, of human life, of animal life, even of plant life, actually, is hierarchical. This is a lie with regard to human life that really probably began around the time of the agricultural revolution. Dan Quinn has written about this, his iconic book, Ishmael. Dan has passed away. I knew him years ago. Really woke a lot of people up to this, that there was a time when, as seasons would happen, and there would be times of abundant food and little food. And as we began farming, the whole agricultural revolution, that it became necessary to store food. And some folks inserted themselves into that process and said, well, we'll be the ones to sort of store the food. Don't worry, we'll take care of it. And then they'd put a lock on the door and decide who to give the food to. And thus the beginning of hierarchical forms of governance, essentially. And this led us to literally thousands of years of kings and warlord kings, people who took power by virtue of violence, theocrats who took power by virtue of claiming that they were the ones who were anointed by a god that only they could hear from, and people who had amassed so much wealth, plutocrats or oligarchs, or in a more modern parlance, monopolists, although my next book, it'll be out in a few months, is about the hidden history of oligarchy, all about this. These very wealthy people rose up and said, no, we should be in charge. And we developed all these rationalizations around this. For example, we're familiar with royal families that have gone on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We're familiar with the papacy, the Catholic Church for 1800 years, more or less. These kinds of hierarchical governance structures. And then there's the third one, which supports plutocracy and oligarchy, which is neo-Calvinism, which is basically, it's kind of at the core of the Trump presidency and an awful lot of so-called conservative ideology in the United States. And that's the idea that goes back to Thomas Hobbes. It actually goes back way before Hobbes, but Hobbes articulated it in 1634 in a book called Leviathan, the giant monster, in which he said that if we didn't have the iron fist of church or state to control people, we would revert to our natural state. And in our natural state, there would be no transportation, there would be no arts and letters, there would be no knowledge, and life would be nasty, short, and brutish. And this became, an ongoing rationalization for this. Well, 100 years later, in the 1750s, John Locke, actually, maybe it was the 1770s. In any case, John Locke came along and said, no, well, actually, just before John Locke, it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau came along and said, but wait a minute. We Europeans are discovering these native tribes in Africa that seem to be, and in the Americas as well, that seem to be living in peace, and life seems to be good. And, thus came Rousseau's noble savage idea. And out of that, Locke came up with this idea that, no, we can govern ourselves. And not only can we govern ourselves, but that there is this fundamental right to, as Locke wrote in Second Treatise on Government, life, liberty, and private property. Now, at the time Locke wrote that, in much of Europe, the king literally owned everything you owned, right down to your underwear. In fact, in some countries, the king owned your wife, and if you were a man, but basically owned everything. And 100 years after that, by the time property rights had been established, certainly in North America, Jefferson said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there was still this question of who should be in charge. Who should run things? How do we know, right? If we believe that Hobbes was right and that, we're all essentially evil, that's the core nature of humanity. And this is the primary difference between what we would call the conservative worldview and the progressive or liberal worldview, is that the conservative worldview is, and I don't mean this as a hit. I mean, read Russell Kirk's 1951 book, The Conservative Mind, that kicked off the modern conservative movement. His opening chapter is about this. The conservative worldview is that people are essentially evil, and therefore we have to figure out how to govern, given the fact that people are evil, and we have to figure out how to organize our society to prevent that evil from overwhelming us. The liberal worldview is more in line with Rousseau and Locke and Jefferson, which is the argument that, no, people are fundamentally good, and that if we take the wisdom of the majority of the people and put that into policy, 90% of the time or more, that will be the right policy. That will be the best thing that can happen. And we call that democracy, from the Greek words demos and kratos. Demos, the people; kratos, power, literally power to the people. Democracy. But there were these folks who were still really struggling with, how is this possible, particularly in the context of modern Christianity. This back to the 1600s, John Calvin, who were struggling with this question: if we take the Bible literally, and all of us, men and women, are born out of a woman, and women were responsible for the original sin, and therefore we're all born in sin and in need of salvation and all that stuff. I mean, there's a fundamental catechism of Christianity. Again, we're back to that kind of conservative worldview of we're all evil. Then how do we figure out who is good among us? How do we discover the rare, exceptional good person who we can choose to lead us? And John Calvin, and frankly, it wasn't quite so much Calvin as it was his followers over the next 50 years. But Calvinism emerged out of this, the religion that Betsy DeVos is a member of. It's in the United States. It's kind of based up there in Grand Rapids. Calvinism says that the way that we know who God decided should run everything is who God has blessed. And how do we know who God blessed? Well, they're the rich people. So the rich people should run everything, because the riches are the visible manifestation of God's blessing, which has been basically, Trump's sales pitch to us. I'm rich, I can do this, you should put me in charge. And, pack his cabinet with billionaires and, all that kind of stuff. it turns out, as I said at the very beginning, this is all a lie. That idea of democracy, that idea that we're fundamentally good, that idea that we are part of all life on Earth, and as part of all life on Earth, we share this common characteristic with all life on Earth, and that is a tendency toward democracy, a tendency toward, not just a tendency, this absolute trait that's foundational to us, toward fairness. Little kids, literally 2-year-olds, even pre-verbal kids, 1-year-olds, know the difference between fair and not fair. You get 3 or 4 kids together and you give one of them, a whole bunch of grapes and the other one grape, and you'll see, they get upset. You distribute them evenly. Hey, it's good. Sometimes they'll even redistribute among themselves. In fact, often. So, but still the story that we've been telling ourselves for the better part of thousands of years, but even philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, the Greek philosophers, the very, very wary of human nature, would say, but, those are the exceptions that prove the rule. And the rule is that, people are bad, that democracy is the abnormal thing. Ben Franklin saying to I'm forgetting her name, the woman who asked him as he left the Constitutional Convention in September of 1787 in Philadelphia, she said, what form of government do we have? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. A democratic republic, in fact. And if you can keep it, right, is the ongoing challenge. But it wasn't that we would be fighting human nature. It was that we would be fighting the oligarchs, the warlords, those who would use violence to rule, and the theocrats. But when we step back and look at humans as animals in a world filled with life, humans as a life form in a world filled with life forms, what we discover is that democracy is the norm. Back a decade or so ago, I wrote a book called What Would Jefferson Do? And when I was writing this book, Kent Conrad and I'm forgetting his first name, his last name was Roper, these two scientists at a university in the UK were studying how animals make decisions. What's the decision-making process that animals engage in? And one of the groups that they were watching was a herd of red deer that were near the university. And there were several water holes. And so they put cameras in the trees to watch the deer to figure out how they do the decision making. And because this is actually consequential stuff, right? When do we go take a drink? When do we leave the area where there's all kinds of cool food, lots of grass growing or little twigs on branches? When do we leave there and go to the water? Because if you leave too early, some people aren't going to get enough food. And if you leave too late, some people may be dehydrated. Deer, red deer. And so this is actually pretty critical stuff. How do you make a decision? And what they discovered was that as the deer got up toward that, and they had several different options as to which water hole to go to. As the deer got up closer and closer to that point where typically they would go drink, just from, observing them for a while, they noticed that the deer would start, as they were grazing, start pointing their heads toward particular water holes. And that when 51% of them had all pointed toward one particular watering hole, just like that, the entire herd would just go. It was like that 51st out of 100, right? That 1% over a majority. And so Conrad and Roper wrote this up. It's been widely published, distributed, and referenced. And I called up Kent Conrad to interview him for my book about this. And I said, have you heard from anybody else? Because it had been out for, 6-8 months, maybe a little less than a year at that point in time. And he said, oh, it's incredible. He said, the entomologist, I got a call from an entomologist, bug guys. And he said, the entomologist said, we're seeing this behavior with insects. Bees come back from, like when a hive has to swarm, when half the hive has to leave, The bees will come back and we'll go out and explore where to go. And several different scouts who found several different areas will start doing little dances, telling everybody about the area they found. And other bees will join them until there's a majority of bees around one particular bee who's got one particular destination in mind, and they'll all go to that destination. He said, I got a call from an ichthyologist, a fish guy. He said, you ever watch a school of fish? It's like you think they're psychic, right? Do they have ESP? They don't have ESP. It's that with every fin motion from side to side as they're swimming along, they are voting left, right, to show we move to the left or right. Well, I'll move an extra quarter inch to the right. And when more than 50% of them move an extra quarter inch to the right, the whole school of fish moves to the right. He heard from a bird guy who said, we're seeing this exact same thing, this voting, literally second by second by second, continuous democracy among geese as they're migrating, among birds as they're flocking in the air. They've seen this with ants. There's almost, they've seen it with muskox. They've seen it with, there are variations that are far more sophisticated than that, but democratic variations on this with apes and chimps. Bottom line, democracy is at the foundation of all life on Earth. Now we find that literally trees do this, and they communicate via mycelium, by fungi. So the bottom line here is that democracy is at our core, at the core of all life. And we need to change our stories, because our stories define what we do. They are how we identify who we are. And we need to change our story to say, we don't need those kings. We just need more democracy.